And welcome everyone to this hybrid meeting in South Huron Council Chambers, Monday, March 31st, 4 p.m. And welcome everyone in the gallery and welcome those that are home participating through Zoom. And we'll ask everyone to make sure their cell phones are turned off and thank our staff for being here today to provide information and facts that we can use to make the best decisions on behalf of South Huron. And we'll call this meeting to order and turn to item number 2. Ms. Masuo Carlson, please.
The South Huron Committee of the Whole approves the agenda as presented.
And a mover, please. Moved by Councillor Neeb, second by Councillor Oak. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? It carries with 7. And is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest at this time from members of council? Not seeing any. Move on to the reports and welcome our staff to present to us now.
Do we have Mr. Sharma? Is he on?
Yes, I am.
Well, welcome, Mr. Sharma, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen and then we can get started. Okay, let's just do a audio and video check. Is everything coming through okay?
Yes, we can see you and we see your presentation.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. All right, so there we go. Yeah, so my name is Arun Sharma, and I'm an asset management advisor here at PSD Citywide. I've been in this role for about going on 4 years now, and I am the primary contact and project manager for this project. I do want to take a second here to thank everyone here for taking time out of their busy day to discuss asset management in general and the 2025 compliant asset management plan. Now, in terms of the agenda for today, I've got a few things that I'd like for us to go through. So first and foremost, I'm going to provide a little bit of a description and explanation on what exactly is asset management, and then tying that to service management and levels of service. So we'll spend a little bit of time going through that. Following that, I will discuss the Ontario Regulation 58817. So these are the legislative requirements set out by the province of Ontario in regards to the asset management plan. So in order for us to do so, I will walk us through a little bit of a timeline, what some of those legislative requirements are, and we'll also take a little bit of a practical look on specifically what levels of service means and what that means for this asset management plan. Following that, I'll then provide a little bit of information regarding the South Huron Asset Management Plan. So a little bit of the project background, the timeline, and just the general process that we go through when we build out asset management plans, just so you can get a full scope and the breadth of the amount of work that goes into creating these asset management plans. Following that, we'll then discuss our proposed levels of service methodology. So in order for us to do so, we're going to take a look at, well, what are our current levels of services are, what are we projected and proposing that these KPIs are over the next 10 years. And in order for us to do so, we're going to hone in on the financial sustainability. So what is the current financial picture at the municipality? And then based on that, we will then talk about specifically what some of our proposed metrics are going to be for the next 10 years, what some of our recommendations are. We'll then conclude the presentation with some general takeaways and then some specific next steps that that all parties involved here in this meeting will be able to take over the next couple weeks and months as we complete this 2025 asset management plan. So to begin, and very briefly to go over what asset management is, when we are talking about asset management, what we're talking about is the strategic approach that integrates various realms. So it's infrastructure assets, it's engineering, financial, the financial aspect as well, the performance considerations of our assets. All of these things tie in to ensure that we have a sustainable delivery of services for our constituents. Asset management essentially then emphasizes planning, tracking, and optimizing the asset performance that are in line with our organizational priorities. So we take a look at risk and risk and cost effectiveness and service delivery. Now, it's a little bit of a long-winded description and definition of what asset management is. So if we really had to boil it down to, what is asset management? Essentially, it's service management. And the reason why we say that is because our roads are, they provide a transportation services for all of our constituents and businesses. Pipes provide clean drinking water, and facilities such as community centers provide a whole slew of benefits, whether that's educational or recreational. So ultimately, when we're talking about asset management, yes, we're talking about the cost and the performance and the risk of us owning assets, but at the end of the day, it really boils down to service management. So I know up to this point, I've already said I've already alluded to levels of service a few times and what some of the legislative requirements are for the 2025 asset management plan. So when we are talking about levels of service, I think it's important for us to first, define what that means. So when we're talking about a level of service, again, a very textbook definition of it, when we're talking about levels of service, it is essentially the measure, the extent, the quality, the performance of a service that is being provided to our users, so our taxpayers, our ratepayers. So that being said, that is what we are speaking about when we're talking about levels of service and how well these levels of service reflects the community needs and expectations. Now, there's a few different ways to look at levels of service. There's two different lenses, essentially. One is from our community levels of service. So how are levels of service experienced at a customer level? And then there's also a technical levels of service, which is observed at an asset or an operational level. So the way I like to think about it is from a taxpayer or from a constituent's perspective is, do I have safe and reliable roads? Is the community center up and operational when I want it to be? From a technical standpoint, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty, the technical KPIs at an operational level. Regardless of how we look at levels of service, though, especially proposed as we are going to be setting metrics for the municipality over the next 10 years. The one thing I do want everyone to keep in mind, it is a very delicate balancing act between the cost of our assets, the risk associated with them, and ultimately the performance as well. So please, I would like everyone to just keep that in mind as we work through these slides here. Now, this next slide here is essentially just what I was discussing, but visualized. So from a community level of service perspective, what does the customer experience? Whether sticking with our roads example, do we have safe and reliable roads? When I drive down the roads, am I hitting a lot of potholes? Excuse me. From an internal view, from a technical levels of service perspective, this is where again, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty, the quantitative metrics, so to speak, which is looking at, well, what is the actual condition of our roads? How is that measured? So for example, our paved roads will look at pavement condition index, or PCI. Another technical levels of service would potentially be, well, how much on an annual basis, how much crack sealing are we doing on our roads? This is how much we're doing currently. Does that need to increase over the next 10 years? So again, two very distinct lenses. Furthermore, when we are defining levels of service and exactly what that means, this is a fantastic diagram that you see here in your bottom right of your screen. This diagram comes from the International Organization for Standardization, so ISO 55000. That really, again, looks at the cost, performance, and risk. And all three of these things tie in to levels of service. So again, with our paved roads example, we know there's a cost attributed to it. We do weekly, monthly, annual operations and maintenance activities. We rehabilitate and renew assets as we see fit, following best practices and institutional knowledge. And then they ultimately, in some cases, will get fully replaced or reconstructed. There, of course, is the performance aspect of it. Again, from a community levels of service, whether something is good or bad, safe, unsafe. whether there's lots of potholes or whether it's very smooth. And then from a technical level, it's the PCI, the Pavement Condition Index, and that's a numerical score that has a very standardized methodology in terms of how it's calculated. And then, of course, there's the risks associated with ownership and asset management, whether it's health and safety, regulatory, and sustainability from a financial standpoint as well. When we are selecting levels of service for our municipality, we do have to keep in mind that there are core values that we need to take into account. So as you can see here on the slide deck, when we are developing and measuring any types of levels of service, we do have, first and foremost, we need to understand what the public values in the provision of municipal services. So the next slide here is a summarization of some of these values. So let's start with the first one here, accessibility. And again, to stay consistent with the theme here, let's look at our paved roads, for example. When we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about, are the roads accessible to all? Vehicles, cyclists, pedestrians? Is there clear signage, and is it easy to navigate? From a reliability standpoint, are our roads maintained in a condition that ensures consistent, predictable travel times and minimal disruptions? From a safety perspective, are we designing and maintaining our roads to minimize risks to all users, including pedestrians and cyclists and cars? Do we have the correct signage, guide rails, and safe pedestrian crossings? From a regulatory standpoint, are we meeting minimum maintenance standards in terms of winter control, pothole repairs? And then when we talk about affordability and sustainability, we mean, are the services we're providing to our constituents, are they affordable now? And is it sustainable for the long-term future? So these are all the values that we have taken into account over the past close to a year now as we have drafted this asset management plan. So these are the core values that we fall back on and say, well, how exactly are our constituents valuing our levels of service and asset management? So these are the values that we fall back on. And of course, when we do have, when we are selecting any type of proposed level of service metric or KPI, it is critical for us to have strategic alignment. And what we mean by that is the messaging within your asset management plan, the KPI selected within the asset management plan, the communication and those metrics selected have to be consistent across the board. So what we mean by that is, we know that the municipality has a climate adaptation policy, a recently adopted fleet policy as of last year. So these strategic documents, in line with our asset management plan, which is your infrastructure plan, along with staff input, all three of these things have to be lockstep with one another to ensure that the proposed levels of service metrics make sense for the municipality. And how do we do that? By selecting metrics that speak to our core values: our accessibility, performance, safety, affordability, sustainability, and meeting regulatory requirements. Now, to go into the exact specifics of the Ontario regulation, I think this is a fantastic graphic that you can now view on your screen there. And essentially, this is a timeline set forth by the province. And this is fantastic because it allows us to, very easily determine whether or not we are compliant given the year. So starting in 2019, we were, in order for us to be compliant with the province, we needed to have a strategic asset management policy, which the municipality, which South Huron did. And then it had an update in 2024. So that's fantastic. And up to this point, we also have a 2024 compliant asset management plan. So again, we're in compliance with the province. So when we say we have a 2024 compliant asset management plan, what exactly does that mean? The asset management plan has a complete inventory of all the assets you own. It has a breakdown of the current levels of service being provided. It has all of the costs associated with those levels of service, but it also has a lot of other really good information in there as well, which is the replacement costs of our assets, the condition of our assets, our average annual requirements. There's a lot of really good information in there. So now that we're in 2025, what are we on the hook for? As per the Ontario regulation, we need to have our proposed levels of service metrics. And then based on what we select, there will be naturally some changes to our life cycle management strategies, our financial strategies, so on and so forth. So getting a little bit granular here on our next slide, these are the specific requirements from the province in order for us to be compliant. Now, by July 1st of this year, 2025, this is what we're required to have in our asset management plan. So we need to ensure that we will be annually reporting on the identified levels of service metrics for the next 10 years. We then need to explain, so after we select our levels of service metrics, we need to have an explanation on why these proposed metrics are appropriate. We need to discuss the risks associated with these proposed metrics and the impact on long-term sustainability, how they differ from what is currently being delivered, what our current levels of service are, whether or not they're achievable, and if so, how the municipality intends to afford the proposed targets. So essentially what we'll need to do is have KPI, so key performance indicators, over the next 10 years. And like I said, anytime when we are indicating that our proposed levels of service is going to be either higher or lower than what is already being delivered, there is inevitably going to be some changes to our life cycle management strategies or financial strategies. And also we've taken into account growth assumptions. So future changes in population and economic activity. We've relied on documents such as your official plan, growth study, so on and so forth, to help drive and help us understand what some of the growth assumptions will be in the municipality. So I know that was quite a lot of information, so I'd like to crystallize that by providing an example. So I'll be providing two examples here. One, of course, staying consistent with our theme, we'll focus on roads, and then we'll look at another asset category and another potential proposed levels of service metric. So here's a really good example, and I will preface and just hammer home that this is an example. This is not specific to the municipality, but let's go through it. So the first one, again, in relation to our roads, so our paved surfaces. Let's say, for example, our current PCI, so our current pavement condition index for the municipality is 75. Now, our level of service statement could potentially be, over the next 10 years, the municipality wants to increase that by a condition of 5. So we'd be going from 75 to 80. Okay, now that we've established what our metric is, we need to then, within the asset management plan, indicate why that's appropriate. Now, there's a multitude of reasons for this, and we have had our workshops with your subject matter experts to go through this. So again, this is just an example that I'm providing. But again, there could be multiple reasons. It could be complaint driven. So are citizens unhappy with it, with what's currently being provided? Are there various reports or studies? So something like an economic development plan, a growth study, a strategic plan that have indicated to us that we need to invest more in our roads? Or alternatively, has council indicated that the improvement of the road network is a priority going forward? Once the justification for this metric has been determined, we will then need to discuss the risks associated with it, how it differs from what's being currently delivered. So in this case, it's quite simple. It's saying our KPI is a condition of 75 and we're improving it to 80. So it's very, very simple. It's essentially better. And then where most of the work comes in though is, well, is that achievable over the span of 10 years? And if it is, how exactly is a municipality going to afford that? Excuse me. Now, I've also provided another example, and this is what we would call non-core infrastructure. So your core infrastructure is your roads, your bridges, your water, sanitary, and storm network. Your non-core infrastructure is essentially everything else. So your facilities, vehicles, land improvements, and your machinery and equipment that's owned and managed and operated at the municipality. So let's take a look at this non-core infrastructure example. So specifically vehicles or rolling stock. Let's say our current, the current assessed condition of our vehicles is 40, so it's in fair condition. Our levels of service statement could be, well, over the next 10 years, the municipality wants to ensure that our vehicles are kept in adequate condition. It's a fair statement to say. That being said, though, the municipality now must indicate why this proposed level of service is appropriate. We must also define what is meant by kept in adequate condition. We know, intuitively that vehicles that are kept in good condition will minimize service disruptions. So when you've got a lot of, when you've got like a snow dump, keeping your vehicles and rolling stock in good condition will ensure that there's minimal service disruptions. We know that by keeping them in good condition, we're avoiding high operations and maintenance costs. But also, when we're talking about keeping them in adequate condition, are they in line with what council and with what we've already said we're going to do? So for example, we've indicated that we need to keep our rolling stock in adequate condition. Well, why have we selected that? Oh, we have a fleet policy that was adopted in 2024 that very explicitly outlines when we need to rehabilitate and replace our fleet assets. So again, once the justification for the metric is determined, very similar to the roads, we'll need to discuss the risks associated with it, how it differs from what's currently being delivered, whether or not it does in fact, it is different, whether or not it's achievable, and if so, how the municipality will afford it. So let's take another practical look at Ontario Regulation 588-17. So as you can see on this slide, from 2023 to 2032, it's a flat line. And the reason why I think this is a very good slide to share and go through is because technically there is no legislative requirement saying that we will increase or decrease the level of service being provided. So from a compliance standpoint, for all intents and purposes, our proposed metrics can be the same as what is currently being delivered. And mind you, in some cases, that it does make a lot of sense, especially if we've gotten feedback either from our subject matter experts, council, or of the public saying like, we're happy with the services that are being provided in X, Y, and Z. We want to keep our, the anticipated property tax increase. We want to keep that manageable. So, we're happy with what we've got. So in some cases, it does make sense. However, that being said, by just maintaining status quo, there is a possibility of missed opportunity to improve our long-term financial planning. So again, the regulation itself doesn't say we must make adjustments. It doesn't say we need to increase our roads, our facility conditions, how much money we put into X, Y, and Z. So nor in the regulation does it specifically state that. However, though, there is definitely a missed opportunity if all we do is say, what is currently being delivered, that's great, and then we're just going to continue status quo. There is a possibility of missed opportunity there. That being said, though, when we are adjusting levels of service, that of course is a big decision. But while it is a big decision, it is important to realize that both from a customer and from a technical level of service standpoint, KPIs are meant to be adjusted to reflect evolving priorities and goals. That being said, of course, resident feedback is also critical because it helps us identify priorities and trade-offs. And then adjustments, whether it's higher or lower, impacts our levels of service, which of course impacts our life cycle program. So as you can see, when we are talking about making changes to the levels of service that we are providing to our constituents, it is a very big decision. And again, going back a few slides ago, again, to keep in mind, it is a very delicate balancing act between the cost, the performance, and risk, which in turn gives us our level of service. Okay, So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about the 2025 asset management plan, so the project that we've been working on. And the reason why I want to do this is to provide a little bit more background information on exactly what it is we've been doing here with your fantastic subject matter experts and our team here at PSD. So when we started on this project going back to last July, so July of 2024, of course, our primary objective was the creation of the asset management plan, making sure that we are 100% in compliance with the Ontario Regulation 588-17, ensuring that all proposed levels of service over the next 10 years are selected. We've taken into account the financial impact and financial picture. We've ensured that they are reasonable, realistic, and attainable proposed metrics. But the secondary objective, in my opinion, it's just as important. And the reason for this is because when we are making any major decisions in regards to our levels of service, having good, consistent, reliable data is the backbone of this, not only just this project, but it is the backbone of good asset management. So the secondary objective, and what we have spent a lot of time on, is just the consolidation and the refinement of our municipal asset data. So what exactly does that look like? Well, essentially from July all the way up until close to January, we've spent quite a lot of time on data improvement. So what we mean by that is the refinement of our centralized asset register. So the municipality utilizes PSD Citywide as the software that houses all of our asset data. So there's thousands of assets, whether it's your roads, your facilities, your water mains, your vehicles, your equipment, everything essentially has been amalgamated, coming in from various data streams. So we've gone through the process of amalgamating it, and then we've also gone through the process of what we call a data gap analysis. Now, the purpose of the data gap analysis is to essentially find gaps within the data. So things that are pertinent to asset management, things such as replacement costs, condition scores. Do we know when the in-service date of XYZ asset? Do we know what that in-service date is? Do we know when we are scheduled to replace these assets? This is what we've spent quite a bit of time on for about 5 or 6 months, just strictly looking at the data, continuously improving it. Because as I said, the financial strategy, the projections, long-term planning, that's only as good as the data that feeds into the report. So it is critical that we really hammer home the point that for best practices in regards to asset management, we check in on our data, we update it accordingly when new data becomes available. That being said, and moving on then, the other thing that we'd worked on with our with municipal staff was we had a series of workshops and supporting documentation, because what we wanted to do was leverage the subject matter expertise at the municipality so we understand how assets are managed from an operations and maintenance standpoint, renewal and rehabilitation and replacement. We wanted to get a good understanding of the practices that are in place at the municipality. And in doing so, we're able to document some systematic risks, the levels of service being provided, because that gives us a good idea of what our proposed metrics are going to be over the next 10 years. The third and final process in this project was looking at the financial strategy. So as I said, data is the backbone of asset management. So having good data gives us accurate annual requirements. So we've got the annual requirements to ensure that our assets receive appropriate funding. And then we also looked at, well, what funding do we have available, whether through property taxes or user rates, sustainable funding provided by the province. And as we understood that and looked at the funding gap that inevitably exists in all municipalities, coming up with a strategy to bridge that gap. We know with all municipalities, there's going to be some sort of a funding gap. So what strategies can we employ to ensure that we bridge that gap, minimize that as much as possible? Okay. So that feeds into our proposed levels of service methodology. So as we were going through and having our workshops, it wasn't as simple as, picking metrics out of thin air. Like, we had a very systematic approach to this. So from January up until March, well, still in March, but it's essentially April now, but January up to March, we had various workshops with our subject matter experts. Because again, we wanted to understand, like, these are our current levels of service metrics, which ones are worth tracking over the next over the next 10 years, which ones are worth tracking, which ones can we refine. So we had that conversation. And then we also wanted to ensure that we are aligning our proposed metrics with corporate strategies and goals, while of course understanding the municipality's current financial picture. So again, very quickly, I'm just gonna knock this off very quickly here, the legislative requirements, because it is very critical for us to really have that understanding. But essentially, with the legislative requirements, it's what are our metrics going to be over the next 10 years? How are we going to afford it? Is it achievable? And how does it differ from what's currently being delivered? So let's take a look at the current public-facing asset management plan, which is based on 2022 financial data. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're in the process right now of updating the financial strategy to reflect the proposed metrics. That being said, though, we don't anticipate, wholesale changes to the financial strategy. The numbers will change slightly here and there, whether that's the total overall infrastructure deficit or our investment rate into our assets, but the trends themselves will stay the same. So that's what you see on your slide right now. So I'll give everyone a minute or two to just review it, because there's a lot of really important pieces of information here. So when the 2024 asset management plan was drafted and approved by council, so that would have been last year, so last May and June, it was utilizing 2022 financial data, which is the standard. You can fall back the following 2 years. So it was using 2022 financial data. And based on that information, it was determined that as of right now, the municipality is committing about 6.8 million towards capital projects per year from sustainable revenue sources. So when we say sustainable revenue sources, we're talking about the money collected through property taxes, through user rates, and sustainable government grants and funding, such as OCIF funding or CCBF, which is formerly known as the gas tax. So these are all sustainable funding sources. We don't look at one-time grants. We acknowledge that they are critical for us to upgrade, replace, rehabilitate our assets, but really we want to look at what sustainable sources do we have and create a strategy around that. So it was determined that it's $6.8 million towards capital projects from sustainable revenue sources. The capital requirements themselves was about 14.3 million. Ultimately, that indicates that there's about a 7.487, so $7.5 million gap annually. In terms of percent funded, that illustrates that we are 48% funded. And I want you to keep that number in the back of your mind, as in the next few slides, we're going to talk about what that number means in terms of from a municipal standpoint in relation with other municipalities. So as of right now, in the current public-facing asset management plan, we are 48% funded. The two figures at the bottom are also important because it tells us our target reinvestment rate. So how much money, based on the data that is in the 2024 asset management plan, based on that data, what our target reinvestment rate should be, as opposed to what we're actually investing. As you can see, and what is very common is that the actual reinvestment rate, so the money we're putting back into our infrastructure, is less than the target. So again, I want you to keep these figures in mind. So 1% is our actual reinvestment rate, and our target reinvestment rate is about 2.1%. Now, in terms of digging deeper and being a bit more granular, we've split that up between your tax funded assets and your rate funded assets. So very simply, your rate funded assets are your sanitary sewer system, your water system, and waste disposal. So essentially everything else is funded by your property taxes, your roads, bridges, facilities, land improvements, all your vehicles, and your storm network. So again, the figures here to keep in mind is that total available, which is around 3.5 million, and the requirement based on the previous AMP or asset management plan was 7.6 million. I know there's quite a few figures in here, so we won't get too bogged down into the details. So again, the key figures to keep in mind is the 48% funded, the 1% of actual reinvestment versus that 2.1% target. So those are the numbers to keep in mind. And again, here is a bit of a granular look at your rate funded assets as well. So again, it's very consistent with other municipalities where the total funding that we have available is around 40 to 50% of what is actually required. So I wanted to present all that information because that feeds into what the big piece is, which is sustainability. So based on that information that was provided and over the last year or so, and within the 2024 asset management plan, based on that, the recommendation that you'll see in the current asset management plan really falls in line with other municipalities as well. So to your tax funded assets, we recommended a tax increase of 1.6%. For your water and sanitary, it's 2% and 1.7% respectively. So typically with municipalities, it falls into that 1 to 3% range on an annual basis. So again, as you can see, this falls right in line with in a municipal context in relation with other municipalities. And I think that's really important to keep in mind because us here at PSD, we do provide asset management plans for the majority of Ontario municipalities. So we went through a very good exercise internally of understanding where our municipalities are with their actual reinvestment compared to their target reinvestment. Of course, and I don't think this will be a surprise to anyone, that most municipalities are underinvesting in their infrastructure programs. And if you recall, I told you to keep those two figures in mind, which was the 1% of the actual reinvestment and the 2.14% target reinvestment. As you can see, South Huron falls exactly in line with the average for with other municipalities. So if we were to amalgamate like every municipality and say, okay, what is our target reinvestment rate in relation to what we're actually investing, we're right on par. So I had to take a second look at this because I'm like, oh wow, it's like we're right on the dot there. But that being said, I don't think it will come to a surprise to anyone to hear me say that most municipalities are in fact under investing in their infrastructure programs. But again, it falls back to what I alluded to earlier, where it is that balancing act between the performance, the risk, and the cost ultimately of ownership of these assets. So again, with sustainability, when we're talking about sustainability in the context of infrastructure and asset management, when we talk about sustainable funding, we're talking about funding that we can rely on. That is our own source revenue, property taxes, utility rates, user fees. These are the ones that we know year in and year out we can rely on. However, that being said, in terms of sustainability, we also want to we understand that one-time grants, either from the Ontario or from, from Ontario provincially or federally, while we acknowledge that these are important, we also do have to acknowledge the fact that they aren't necessarily sustainable. What's here today could be gone tomorrow, as we all know. So again, to really hammer home the point, it is between the ability to pay, the willingness to tax, which feeds into cost, performance, risk, which is our levels of service. Now, going beyond just the Ontario regulation and ensuring that we have compliance with OREG, there are a few things that we do need to point out and hammer home in terms of either improving or decreasing the levels of service that we provide. And that, of course, is the trade-offs between cost, performance, risk, between infrastructure programs. So it could be reallocating funding from one asset category to another, between tax rates and program quality. So when we are saying that we are going to change some levels of service, or we propose that our metrics over the next 10 years need to be slightly higher or lower, depending on a variety of reasons, we have to understand that ultimately it comes down to trade-offs, and what trade-offs are we willing to make. But ultimately, any trade-offs that we do make, our infrastructure programs need to be financially sustainable. So now I'd like for us to switch gears and talk specifically about the proposed levels of service metrics that staff and our team here at PSD have collaborated, and what we think makes the most sense for the municipality over the next 10 years. So let's walk through that now. And again, we will work through this quite systematically, where we'll go through each category. So let us begin with our road network. So one of the proposed key performance indicators that we had was the upgrade of all of our LCB road types to HCB. So essentially, the reason for this is because we selected this metric for a few reasons. One, because it's already part of the municipality's initiative to upgrade these type of roads to an HCB road. And the reason for that is because HCB roads are smoother, they last longer, there's a thicker layer on top. So ultimately, they will last longer, so it's financially responsible and sustainable to do so. But we understand that it comes with a little bit of a risk, and that there is a little bit of a higher cost up front. Ultimately, though, we understand that over time, over 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that upgrading these road types from one to another is going to ultimately save the municipality money, and it's financially sustainable and makes total sense to do so. The other two metrics that you see below that really speak to the condition of the assets that our constituents experience on an everyday basis. So we essentially set a bottom target for our sidewalks and our roads, where no more than 10% of either our roads or our sidewalks are going to be in poor or very poor condition. So that is a metric that we've also set forth because it does demonstrate best asset management practices. Because what it does is it ensures that we're updating the appropriate assets on time, that we're leveraging institutional knowledge and expertise. We know what roads and sidewalks need to be brought forth as candidates on an annual basis. So by setting this target in place, it ensures that the right assets get renewed, rehabilitated, replaced at the right time. And that last metric that we've set forth is an average risk rating. Now, not to get too granular here, but the average risk rating is a fantastic metric because it speaks directly to that third prong of levels of service. If you recall, there's the performance, the cost, and the risk. So that average risk rating is an absolutely fantastic proposed metric that we can calculate for the next 10 years. And essentially, the average risk rating is a quantitative metric that is a score from 0 to 25. And how that's calculated is we've got something called the probability of failure and the consequence of failure. Your assets go through a quantitative risk analysis in the Citywide software, where we understand the condition, where we look at the condition of your assets, the replacement costs of your assets, along with a whole host of other attributes. And we feed it through our software, and it very conveniently and accurately maps out, well, what are our high risk assets as defined by the parameters we've set forth? What's our high, medium, low, no risk assets? And the reason why this is a fantastic metric is because it's grounded in good data. And the other reason why it's a really good metric is because based on the life cycle strategies that we employ at the municipality, we're able to accurately say, this is our risk score in 2024, 2025. We can project out based on our life cycle activities and how we manage our roads, what the risk rating will be in 2027, 2029, 2033. So for that reason, we thought it was an absolutely fantastic metric to integrate into the municipality's asset management plan. Okay. Now, the next one is in regards to our bridges and structural culverts. So structural culverts are defined by those culverts that are greater than a 3-meter span. So all your bridges and structural culverts. So as you can see right now, we've got highlighted the Bridge Condition Index, so the BCI. And the reason for this is because we're currently in the process of finalizing the asset register in preparation for the asset management plan. So the target in and of itself is being determined right now and should be buttoned up in the next couple of weeks. But the good thing about utilizing a condition score or BCI from your bridges and structural culverts is because it's aligned with a biennial inspection that is done on all of these assets. And that is in the form of your OSIM report, so your Ontario Structure Inspection Manual. And these OSIM reports are done every 2 years, and they give us a really great breakdown of this is the condition of your assets, this is the projected capital expenditure over the next 1, 5, 10 years. And it gives us a lot of really good information. So because of that, because it's grounded in truth, in good data, we can very accurately set a proposed target for the next 10 years. So if we say the municipality's BCI is a score of 65, and then over the next 10 years, with the identified work completed and with the identified work, we can understand and see that it'll remain in 65, or it'll actually increase to 70 or 75. So we're actually in the process of understanding what that target is going to be. But that being said, again, it's a really great KPI or metric because, again, it's grounded in truth and in actual data. And that also feeds into the next one, which is having zero loading or dimensional restrictions. So again, this is aligned with our OSIM inspection, but it's also aligned with institutional operations and maintenance and rehabilitation recommendations. Our subject matter experts know our bridges, know our assets inside out. And it was determined that in the next 10 years, we don't anticipate any zero loading or dimensional restrictions. So let's highlight that within our asset management plan because it indicates that we are following asset management best practices. We are keeping up with our operations and maintenance, our rehabilitation recommendations. We are putting forth the correct candidates on during our annual budget for what needs to be rehabilitated, replaced, so on and so forth. So again, 2 very good metrics to keep in mind over the next 10 years because they're grounded in truth, grounded in data. And then, of course, the average risk rating, everything that I said for the road category also applies to our bridges and structural culverts. the average risk rating you will see is it's a common theme here where we're going to do this for all of our asset categories, and it just makes a whole lot of sense too. Okay, the next slide, what you're looking at here is encapsulates all of our underground infrastructure. So our storm, water, and our sanitary sewer. Now, again, we are currently in the process of finalizing the asset register. So the specific targets will be determined in the coming weeks. That being said, though, very similar to our road infrastructure, we want there to be a bottom baseline of how much of our asset portfolio is in poor or very poor condition. We don't want that. So once we determine what that baseline is, that of course will be in the asset management plan. And the reason why it's not in this slide right now is because, again, we're going through the process of finalizing the asset register, but also this shows best asset management practices because we're doing our due diligence here. We're reviewing all of the data. We're looking at the financial picture, and then we're determining what is a reasonable, realistic goal for the municipality to ensure that, let's say, 10% of our network is not in poor or very poor condition. So we're actively working through that process. So when you receive the asset management plan, you'll see these specific metrics laid out within the plan itself, along with the rationale behind why those targets have been selected. And again, the average risk rating, to keep it consistent, we're going to utilize that for all of our categories. And then the one other metric that we've got is in relation to our sanitary sewer network. Again, not to get too granular here, but the proposed metric here is to ensure that there are 0 bypasses at our pumping stations. So the reason why this is fantastic is because by setting that target, saying like we don't want to have any bypasses at pumping stations in any given year, that indicates that the pumping stations are operating effectively without any overflow or diversion of wastewater to unintended locations. So from an environmental, operational, and regulatory standpoint, so all three of those things, all three very important things, it's an absolutely fantastic metric to have. And to say we have 0 bypasses as our target really does indicate that we are on top of all of our operations and maintenance with our pumping stations to ensure that that target is met. Switching gears then to our rolling stock. So this would be the municipalities' vehicles, and then handheld machinery and equipment. There are 2 metrics that the PSD and the subject matter experts have come to a conclusion and are putting forward. Now, in regards to our rolling stock, the really fantastic thing with this KPI is, well, first of all, the KPI itself is just that our assets replaced as per the municipality's fleet policy. So there was a fleet policy that was approved in 2024. So the actual metric itself was in any given year, so 2025 and for the next 10 years, did we replace the fleet assets that are in compliance with our fleet policy? And the way we've determined that is within the actual fleet policy itself, there is a fantastic methodology, scoring system essentially for all of our fleet. So if it's X amount of years old, if it's reached a certain amount of kilometers, or if it's for your machinery, a certain amount of hours worked, the actual assessed condition of the asset as well. So there are a multitude of variables that feed into this quantitative score. So we want to be able to say, okay, we've set forth a policy that was approved in 2024. Now it's on us to actually ensure that these assets are replaced as per the policy. So in any given year, on an annual basis, when we're reviewing our budget, that would be a great time to say, okay, were we in compliance with with our fleet policy that we set in 2024? Did we replace the assets when we said we would? And if it's a simple yes or no, and if it is a no, then there has to be a discussion in terms of, well, why didn't we? Having that open communication and transparency then is key because, as I said, it's one thing to have a policy in place. It's another to actively use it in our decision making, and that's what we want to do. And of course, again, not to beat a dead horse, but the average risk rating again is a fantastic score, or a fantastic KPI metric to use because we've got all those attribute details in our citywide software, so we can accurately project out the quantitative risk rating of each asset over the next 10 years. So we're almost wrapped up here. Moving on then to land improvements. And when we're talking about land improvements, essentially we're talking about all of our outdoor play structures. Now, again, of course, the average risk rating we are proposing to do that. And the other metric that we have in here is ensuring that all playgrounds are inspected on an annual basis. And the reason for that is because of the nature of the assets, because of who uses the assets. And the comments and the rationale behind this is because we want to make sure that we have in writing in place that we are inspecting these critical assets, so like our parks and outdoor structures, and it demonstrates best practices. So we've got the standard itself right there. So there is a visual and a written inspection that will occur on a yearly basis, just to make sure that yes, all of our parks are in fantastic condition, or in appropriate condition, I should say, to ensure the health and safety of all of those who use it. So again, another fantastic KPI. And with that, it's very simple. It's just saying like, did we do our annual inspections? Yes or no. It's simple, it's easy to understand, it's reliable, but it also demonstrates best practices as well. Moving on then with our facilities, our final category here. Now, the proposed level of service KPI is to ensure that at a minimum, 20% of our facilities are in fair or better condition. Now, the current asset management plan does indicate that most of our facilities are in relatively poor shape. That being said, though, quite a few building condition assessments have been completed over the past couple of years. So we do anticipate that the updated asset management plan will look different in terms of the condition. But again, we wanted to set essentially a floor where it's at least 20% of our facilities or more have to be in fair or better condition. The other reason for this is because we also want to ensure that the municipality is allocating the appropriate funding, the identified sources of funding to ensure that critical infrastructure is being replaced and rehabilitated. So if we're starting off by saying, well, only 20% of our facilities are in fair or better condition, we do anticipate that that is going to improve over the next 10 years. And we want to be able to show that because it's my understanding that quite a bit of work will be going into the facilities over the next 5 to 10 years, whether that's the Dashwood Fire Hall, the roof and sprinkler system at the South Huron Recreational Center. I am aware that quite a bit of work is going to be going into our facilities. So having that as our metric will allow us to indicate and show to our constituents like we are improving the condition of our assets, of our major facilities from a year-to-year basis. So again, it's a fantastic metric to have in there. And of course, we've also included the average risk rating as well, just to keep things consistent as well. Now, in terms of the takeaways and next steps, one thing that I do want to note in regards to just asset management in general. And I hope I've conveyed this going through the slides, but asset management, and with the creation of this asset management plan, it's not so much as we've got our plan, it's set in stone, and now we execute. Asset management is always evolving. As better data becomes available, it needs to be integrated into our asset register, so our where we house all of our data. And the reason for that is because good data is the backbone of setting, recording, adjusting any type of metrics. Because of that, our recommendation has always been, excuse me, is to start small. Pick a few metrics that we know we can record over the next few years, and then expand. One of the legislative requirements is that the asset management plan is reviewed in 2030. It goes through a formal review process, very similar to what we're doing right now for 2025. So rather than selecting 5, 10 metrics for each and every category, start small, collect good data, and then expand in 2030. So that being said, though, while we do need to have projections over the next 10 years, they must be revisited in 2030. It's for that reason that we start small, start with attainable goals, start with what we know that we're going to be improving, whether that's from a facility standpoint or upgrading our roads from one surface type to another. Start with what we know. Start with small incremental changes and improvements. As better data or updated data, reports, and studies become available, it will be crucial to integrate them into not only our asset register, but also integrate them into the municipality's asset management practices. And that being said, I want to conclude the level of service portion by saying, like, when we do select these metrics, the metrics themselves need to be relevant, measurable, actionable, because ultimately these things is what makes them valuable. And I'm hoping that as we've gone through the metrics, they make sense, they're relevant. You can see that all of them are measurable, all of them have action items attached to them, because ultimately that's what gives us and our constituents value. So again, I do want to give kudos and major props to the municipal staff here, because as we have collaborated over the last year or so, municipal staff have selected KPIs which are relevant, measurable, actionable, all while considering best asset management practices. So we've taken a look at cost, performance, and risk. And again, that diagram you see on the right-hand side, this is what feeds into establishing levels of service. One recommendation that we do have here that I'd like to indicate is that it's our understanding that potentially a public open house will occur in April, May, and I think that's a fantastic idea. And the purpose of that essentially would be for staff to engage with the public on what the municipality's proposed metrics are going to be for the next 10 years. Our subject matter experts know their assets inside and out. So they'll be able to explain why these metrics are appropriate, what's being done at the municipality, whether there are any concerns from our constituents. They'll be able to ease that, as they are very knowledgeable and know, as I said, know these assets inside and out. Finally, in terms of the major takeaway and next step for everyone here on council is the asset management plan, the draft itself. It will be brought forth to council at some point in May. At that point, the recommendation from us here at PSD and staff will be for the asset management plan to be recommended. We will be recommending that it is adopted by council. And the reason for that is because of that July 1st deadline, which is set forth by the province. So we will be getting that asset management draft at some point in early to mid-May to allow for ample time to review the document. We're more than happy to field any questions just to ensure that the asset management plan is approved by that July 1st deadline. So that is everything for me. I hope I know we went through quite a lot of information there. Uh I'm hopeful that that was informative, and at this point I'll just open it up to the floor if there are any questions or if there's anything you would like to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. Well done. Good presentation. Are there any questions from members of the committee of the whole? Councillor Neeb, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mayor Finch, and thank you very much for the presentation. I just mainly a question of clarity about the average risk rating. For a lot of them, it says it's a quantitative metric that provides a 0 to 25 score, and I'm just wondering, is that a specific number? Is that a range? And what are we basing risk on? Because I mean, is that could be a subjective thing. Like, is there a standard that we're comparing risk to in order to dictate how risky something is, I guess?
Yeah, good question. So the risk rating or the risk score itself is it is determined by in collaboration with us here at PSD and with your internal subject matter experts. And what we're doing is we're looking at the various attributes that each asset has. So for example, when we're trying to determine what are our high risk assets for our roads, we would look at, well, what's the condition of the road? Is it a local collector arterial road? What's the replacement cost of that road? Is it close to, depending on whether or not that information is available, is it close to other critical infrastructure, whether that's a hospital or you know, or anything like that? So what we're doing is going through the process of saying, okay, we've got our asset data. Now, how can we create a quantitative metric around that while understanding these are the metrics we're looking at? This is what feeds into the probability of failure, and this is the consequence of failure. So we've got our condition, which would be our probability, the road class itself, and then the consequence of failure, whether or not it's near critical infrastructure or what that replacement cost is. I will also say that the variable selected, or like the math that goes into it, you can also see this in the appendix of your current asset management plan. So I'm not sure if I've got it open right now, but if you scroll to the I believe it is Appendix C, you can very explicitly see what the risk rating criteria is that feeds into how we determine how much of a risk a certain asset is.
Thank you. Councillor Oak, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mayor. And thanks for the information today. One question I had is you commented that the municipality is committing about $6.8 million to capital projects from sustainable revenue sources.
Correct.
I guess in this current budget that we just passed, we did somewhere between $14–16 million that we have in capital projects that we're doing now. I know there's some where, you know, the connecting links where we're getting $3 million from a different level of government. I guess that all comes to help catch us up at the same time. I know it's not a stable revenue source, but it's money that we are using to help reduce that deficit that we have.
Right.
But I'm not sure that 6.8 is the right number, because I think we're putting more than that. Because the last few years we've been doing capital projects in you know, more than $10 million a year. So
Yeah.
I just don't know where that 6.8 came from.
Right. Okay. So thank you for your comment. Now, the 6.8, I totally understand where you're coming from in terms of, well, we utilize other funding streams. The asset management plan itself, OREG does specifically define what sustainable funding is. So that would be your property taxes, your user rates, CCBF, and your OCIF funding for the most part. These are what is classified as sustainable funding sources. That being said, though, within the financial strategy of your current asset management plan, we do also allude to the use of reserves So we do know that every year that the municipality does its due diligence and puts funding away into reserves for a rainy day. We also realize that one-time grants are critical for us to update and renew and replace assets, specifically like facilities, for example, as these are high-ticket items. We also, within the asset management plan, understand that the use of debt is critical in terms of funding assets as well. So, to answer your question, or to just provide a bit of context there, that 6.8, it certainly seems low, but that is the funding that is deemed as sustainable set forth by the province. That's not to say, projects aren't paid for by other means. It's just defining what is sustainable.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councillor Vaughn.
Yes, I wanted to ask a little bit about the KPIs that we've established. So just kind of looking at the road network as an example, where we've actually said that less than 10% of roads being in poor, very poor condition, and similar for sidewalks.
Right.
And so as I was looking at these sort of proposed KPIs, the thought came to me in terms of where are we now?
That's a good.
So like we say that cost is part of this whole equation and a balancing act. So less than 10% of roads being in poor, very poor condition. If we're at, say, 25% right now, that to me says, whoa, that's a lot of money to get down to the 10. So I'm trying to understand where are we now, and depending on where we are now, how long it is going to take us to get to that 10%. Is that aspirational, or is that something we look at every budget? Yeah, that's what
It's a fantastic question. I'm actually I'm in the software right now, so I can give you a precise answer. What I can do though is assure you that the 10%, it was selected because it took into account the information that we have right now. So I certainly understand your, possible concerns if we're saying, well, if it's at 25, how could we possibly get that down to 10? That's just not realistic. So what I can say is the 10% was selected because it does fall in line with what we are projecting based on the budget that has been forwarded our way and the anticipated capital expenditure over the next 10 years. So that's where that 10% comes from. Now I'm trying to pull up some information right now. What I can say is that the sidewalks, from what I can see right now, and I've done this very quickly, but from what I can see within the system, is that our sidewalks are in fantastic shape. Like it's got a projected condition of 83. So right off the bat, like that's an excellent score. So I don't anticipate, to answer your question, I don't suspect that it's going to go from 25 down to 10, because that just would not be reasonable and realistic. But I can assure you that when we went through our workshops with the subject matter experts, that number was selected because it makes sense and is in line with what our current condition is and how we anticipate the municipality spending its money over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I did see that 83% figure, but I also think I saw in there that there was only something like 41% of our sidewalks have even been assessed. And so that made me kind of go, well, how reliant can we be on the 83% of really good sidewalks?
That's a fair point. That's a very fair point, because in most cases, in an ideal world, we of course would like to have 100% of our assets assessed. That would be ideal. But what we have gone through the exercise of doing, though, is where we have assessed data, we've got it. And where we don't, we have reviewed what we call the estimated useful life of those assets. So depending on the material type and just like the actual, so the material type of the sidewalk, we've used industry best practices and standards to say, okay, this type of sidewalk lasts X amount of years on average if it's this material as opposed to this material. So we have gone through that as well. That is a very good point though by you, where it's how reliable is what we call an age-based approach as opposed to an assessed approach. But that being said, sidewalks are typically quite projecting out condition for sidewalks is much more feasible and easier to do than, let's say, that of like your roads, for example.
Okay, thank you. Follow-up, Councillor Vaughn?
Just one more follow-up on that.
I don't see any.
We're about to get another rendition of this. This is step one coming to council.
Right.
So, are we going to be receiving sort of an approximate cost of what it's going to take to get to the achievement of some of these KPIs?
Yes. Yeah. All that will be, so all of these KPIs will be built into the financial strategy. You can also expect those as I mentioned, those figures will be updated because they are a little dated now because they were relying on 2022 figures. So they will be updated. Those KPIs, that it will be built into the asset management plan, and all that information will be included in the financial strategy.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Go ahead, Councillor Vaughn.
I do have another question, but it doesn't relate to that specifically, so it's okay. All right. Okay, so very early on in the presentation, talked about basically looking at the level of service from two perspectives, one being technical, which was more like an operational perspective, and that was called a TLOS.
Yep.
And then there was the public and customer needs / expectation, which was called a CLOS. And so that started off as a really good beginning. And then as we went through the whole presentation, I saw more and more on the operational and the technical, and very, very little on what from the public, you know, and
Right.
so I saw a little bit about maybe complaints might inform us in terms of what the public is looking for. So I guess what I'm asking is there going to be a stronger focus on the public, or is that part of what our open house is all about? Just thinking needs and expectations. How are we going to put that in there as part of the
Right.
balance?
Okay. Yeah. So it's a good point. Good question. Now, the reason we focused in on the technical levels of service is because we want to take a very standardized and methodical approach to what are our metrics going to be. If you take a look at your current asset management plan, we within each category, you'll also see what the community levels of service are. And these community levels of service, for lack of putting it more eloquently, it's essentially just like a layman description of the service being provided. So for example, it's how much roadway do we own, or what exactly is our road network, and that's essentially a map. So the customer levels of service metrics aren't so much metrics as what they are instead are really just maps and what vehicles or what facilities are owned and operated by the municipality. So that's why we haven't focused too much on that, like the specific community levels of service metrics. That being said, though, like the technical levels of service takes that customer feedback into account. So whereas the customer levels of service are basically just statements saying we own XYZ, this is our road network, and you illustrate that in the map. The technical levels of service is where we can really be like, these are our metrics, this is how we derive them, and we can still relate that back to the customer.
Thank you. Mr. Carlson, go ahead, please.
Through the chair, I'm wondering if, Scott, if you could come up and maybe outline a bit of our communication plan and the open house. Thank you.
And this is Mr. Curry, one of our staff members.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through you to council. So staff have prepared a consultation strategy on this document. Our aim is to launch this week, pending the discussion that happens tonight. Not tomorrow, because April 1st has a bad reputation for putting stuff out there. But the idea is to launch a consultation both online that culminates in an open house. We're aiming at April 30th, 4 to 7 in the Verity Room, basically where we seek public input on some of the core themes of tonight. So for example, getting feedback on the values that the community places on assets. You saw that list prior in the presentation. Getting feedback on willingness to pay to close that infrastructure deficit that we heard about tonight, as well as just get general thoughts, open mic on what people think and feel about the levels of service that they receive now from our assets. Simple stuff, simple questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Mr. Curry, for that. And Councillor Oak, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Just a question on the metrics for the road network. One of them talked about 10% of the roads being poor, very poor condition, less than 10%. Is that including our gravel roads in that metric?
No, this would just be your surface, your paved road. So that would be your basically everything that's not unpaved or gravel.
So just to follow up, I guess my question is I'm wondering why that's not included, because we have a large percentage of our roads are gravel in the municipality. So
right,
wondering why they're not, they respect the same type of asset management as our paved roads do.
Yep. Thank you for the question. Now, with gravel roads, the reason we don't typically include them in for KPIs is for a few reasons. The first one being that gravel roads do receive something that we just call perpetual maintenance. So they are typically in a good or very good condition year after year, and that is because of the strategy that you have in place. So one, it doesn't really add too much value to say it's in good condition, it'll remain in good condition. I mean, we certainly can include that, but because it receives perpetual maintenance, it doesn't really make too much sense to include it. The other reason is because of typically how gravel roads are funded. So most of the time, in most cases, they would just come out of your operating budget. So there's no capital expenditure attached to it. That being said, though, if there is an initiative to, let's say, we want to upgrade X amount of kilometers of gravel roads to a surface treated road over the next 10 years, I'm all ears and would agree that should be a really good KPI metric, because we can speak to the fact that, okay, we're going to be upgrading these type of roads and this is how we're going to fund it, and this is these are the benefits of upgrading our gravel roads. So the long answer, less long, is one, it's because of perpetual maintenance and they're typically always in good condition. And two, because of the funding source, it's generally just out of your operating budget. So if there's no capital expenditure attached to it, no, there really is no need to set forth a KPI. But I'm all ears to, if you would like to see, maybe if we do want to have a little bit of a conversation regarding that.
Councillor Oak, follow up.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thank you for the answer. There are times where there is capital requirements for drainage or different things as well. But long term, that's a further council discussion on down the road about upgrading some roads from time to time. And I'm sure we'll hear about it at the public open house as well. So
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Great, thank you. Councillor Vaughan, you have something? Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Okay. So this question's maybe a little off topic, maybe not. I'm thinking about level of service for many things we do here in the municipality. So examples might be level of service about snow removal, and I know regulatory guidelines come into play there. But there's also, from time to time, thoughts that go through my mind about level of service for sidewalk plowing, and how do we as a council come to making a decision about whether that's a service we should continue to offer. Is that sustainable? Is that cost prohibitive? It involves fleet management, things like that. And also, I'm thinking in terms of levels of service that might even go to a level of, let's say, what you offer through your recreation facilities, like what your hours are for the pool or what your hours are for the arenas and public skating and what you allow there. So does that actually fit in an asset management plan at all?
Yeah.
Or is that something completely different?
No, there's a lot of good questions in there and a lot of good comments. I will say regarding snow removal and creating a level of service, the MMS, so minimum maintenance standards, does indicate that the municipality has to plow sidewalks, snow, or sidewalks, roads, and so on and so forth. And there are very specific standards in there. So the municipality, it's safe to assume that the municipality already does so. Now, so I would be opposed to perhaps bringing that in as a metric unless there is a concerted effort to improve that in terms of like the time, like from a time standpoint. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but let's say on average it takes 26 hours to remove snow from sidewalks, and we want to improve that to 23, let's say. That could be incorporated into an asset management plan. But unless there's a concerted effort or a desire to do so, then I would be opposed to bringing it into an asset management plan. That being said, though, if that's something that the municipality has looked at in terms of improving, let's say over the past few years, just because we do get so much snow and that's something that we would like to improve on, then I would say, yeah, we could perhaps have that conversation. But I will, I do want to indicate that like having that type of a metric is because it's like snow, it's related to snow. Is that something that we know we would be able to achieve on a year in, year out basis? Because we would be held to that standard, right? And if we're already in compliance with the minimum maintenance standard, which we are, I would be very hesitant to bring that in. But you're not wrong in that it can be used as a metric. And I have seen some large municipalities try to incorporate that, whether that's complaint times for like potholes or snow removal. I have seen large municipalities try to incorporate that. But again, and going back to what I've been really trying to reiterate is just we've got to have the data to support that. So who would be logging that data, who would be tracking it, who would be updating that on a year to year, on a month to month basis, essentially. So I hope that that's giving you some context there. It definitely can be a metric, but I would be a little hesitant to use it right now.
Thank you. Ms. Masuda calls you to comment.
Through the mayor. This is basically capital. Those examples were good. They were operational. So I think it would make more sense for a service delivery review. I think that is more in line with reviewing what outputs are actually being produced, what the unit costs are, as well as the quality and effectiveness. It is kind of a different process. And I know in the past that we did our IT service delivery review. That was done as well, I think in 2020, 2021. as well as KPIs earlier, I think 2018, 2019. I think it would be that type of thing for services. This is more based on assets.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Oh.
you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Any other questions at this time? Okay, not seeing any. Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. Great presentation and Q&A afterwards. Appreciate all you do. And if there's nothing further, we can go on to the recommendation. Mr. Sue Carlson.
Thank you.
The South Huron Committee of the Whole receives a presentation of Arun Sharma, PSD Citywide Asset Management Advisor, regarding 2025 Asset Management Plan Levels of Service.
And a mover, please. Moved by Councillor Neeb, seconded by Councillor Oak. Any discussion? Call the question. All in favor? That carries with 7. Thank you. And Ms. Masood calls number 5.
The South Huron Committee of the Whole does now adjourn at 5:31 p.m.
Moved by Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Neeb. No discussion. Call the question. All in favor? That carries with 7. Thank you very much and enjoy your evening.